So it is absolutely wonderful to be with you today, and thank you for that kind introduction and the invitation to be with Jim. I get to hear about you a lot from my colleagues in global partnerships, and it's great to be with you today. So the title of the presentation is In a Mirror Dimly, Women in Mission Through the Lens of the United Nations. I'm absolutely passionate about the subject, and I'm not the only one. We have many amazing, powerful, and passionate women advocates who are on this call who are also involved with the United Nations. I won't name names because I'm afraid of forgetting everybody or anyone, but you know who you are, and this is work in shared ministry that we do together. So I'd like to start us off with scripture. No doubt you've seen it in the title. It is from 1 Corinthians 13:12. The Apostle Paul, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And we know that Paul refers here to the human state, that in this life we will only have a partial and imperfect view of God, and we will only see God face to face and Jesus Christ in the next life. And we wait and long for that day. And by extension, our desire expressed in global mission to know God and to see Christ in the face of the other can only be dimly reflected in this life. But if we see in a mirror dimly, how does that affect women and mission at the United Nations? We'll start by asking ourselves, how do we see in the mirror when we enter into mission relationship with the UN context? Do we reflect Christ? Do we see Christ reflected back to us? We're going to attempt an answer to this by comparing and contrasting the ideas of global mission, both defined by the Church and by the United Nations. And then we'll present a comparison of the context of women and mission, both from the UN viewpoint and then from the viewpoint of the Episcopal Church mainly. We'll also talk about the Anglican Communion. But I'm a researcher at heart and a former academic, incorrigible as a teacher. I can't resist throwing in a little mini research question for us in the next 45 minutes, which is, how does this lens affect women and mission? How does it influence the Anglican and Episcopal women in the context of the United Nations to reflect global mission in this secular environment, otherwise known as public theology? Do they interpret their work and role differently when they're encountered? How does that change them? How does that change the church? How does that change the United Nations? How does this lens affect them? And how does the approach to their concerns and needs differ according to the underlying values and connotations of the UN context? That's a lot of questions. I'm definitely timing this for 45 minutes, and we will be whizzing through a bunch of material, but I understand you will have the PowerPoint, and you can call me and we can talk about this for hours because there is plenty to say. But first, let's talk about, if I can manage to move to the next slide, which I do not seem to be able to do. There we go. Comparing global missions in the Christian, Episcopal, Anglican, and UN context. Some of you may recognize this rather famous painting by a member of the LDS community of Jesus knocking at the door of the United Nations. And if you were around in the 50s and 60s, you might remember that there was a lot of antagonism and a lot of conspiracy theory about the United Nations and its intents of a new world order, and where does Jesus fit into all of this context? So we imagine here we have the United Nations on one side and Jesus representing Christianity on the other. And so when we look at global missions and comparing them, what do we see? Well, biblically, first of all, we all know, I'm talking to missiologists here. You know this even better than I do. So I will just reference Matthew 28. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Go, go, go is what we always hear in relation to global mission. And we are very fortunate to do that and to be able to do that at the United Nations by entering into international territory from the moment we entered the UN campus. We know that theologically we have been going through change and moving away from former ideas of global mission that are patriarchal or based on privilege or conquest, supremacy, towards a new understanding of global mission as transformational partnership. And you all have been deeply involved with that. I am very grateful, and these you will see are the fruits of your labors. We're going to talk and reference today through a bit of contextual analysis of the work you all have done. So my thanks to the GEM Network, the Standing Commission on World Mission, and my colleagues in the Office of Global Partnerships for providing this extremely up-to-date reference point for global mission. I'm sure I don't need to go into the details. You probably know this by heart, but I will say that I understand this is going to General Convention in July and has been very carefully thought out. And I'm very grateful because it has provided the background and foundation for how we're going to analyze the work of women at the United Nations. And very specifically, the resolution refers to the guiding principles for world mission. Congratulations to those of you who have put this together. I know it has been the result of long and hard work. And I am pointed out in red some key words that we will not have time to read, but you can go back to this if you want when you receive the PowerPoint. But words that, for me, working in the United Nations context, resonate in terms of the comparability to the ways in which we operate and do ministry in the UN context. So crossing boundaries and crossing borders is obviously part of that. The advocating on important issues of the day, poverty, violence, oppression, threats to global health, environmental degradation, refugees and migrants, asylum seekers, advocacy, learning together, mutual discovery. Those are all words that also resonate in the United Nations context. But here, for my thinking as someone who is not a missiologist, but very much a Christian working in a global environment, these are the words that I will hold on to as the foundation for understanding how we do global mission at the United Nations. We also know that since 2015, our Episcopal Church has been lifting up 3 church-wide priorities that intersect with our sense of global mission. I don't need to name them, you know them, and you're already doing them out in the mission field, I'm sure: evangelism, creation care, and racial reconciliation. And then, of course, as members of the Anglican Communion, we also continue to lift up the 5 marks of mission, which resonate very closely with the guiding principles on world mission that we have seen. So there we have it, a very brief reminder of our sense of global mission as Episcopalians, as Christians, as Anglicans. Now let's have a look at how we would understand global mission from a secular position, the global mission, so to speak, of the United Nations. And I'm calling this global mission with a secular face. Now, I imagine that most of us have some understanding already of what happens at the United Nations, but there's a lot of false information out there and a lot of TV and media influence in September. So I just want to recall for us some basics. And the very basic is the signing of the United Nations Charter back in 1945. That if there was supposed to be an equivalent to a Bible in UN terms, then this would be it. It is not a sacred text, obviously, and we will explore that in a moment, but it is the foundation upon which all of the member states that sign the United Nations Charter agree to adhere by. When it was signed in 1945 and entered into force, it signified the start of this international organization. So this is the international agreement, if you will, that brought the world out of World War II. And as you will probably recall, the United Nations was founded back then in order to try and avoid a World War III and establish a new international order to maintain peace and security. So on the left here, we have a photo of the actual conference itself. And for those of you who visited Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, you may recognize the mural on the right, which is in the cathedral, as that was one of the locations where the conference was held back in 1945. So much like our guiding principles for world mission, the United Nations has its own principles, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on contextual analysis here because it's important to understand what guiding words are and are not in the Charter compared to our understanding of world mission at this time. So the Charter of the United Nations has, fortunately, we're not going to go through all of it, but I want to point out once again to you some of the key words, and in particular, two things in relation to today's presentation. One is faith in fundamental human rights, that the value of the human person is lifted up at the United Nations as it is for us in our sacred texts, and specifically the equal rights of men and women. So we are not simply talking about human beings with a hierarchy. We are talking about an organization that seeks to establish equality rather than hierarchy. Another thing you might notice that is missing is the word God, as well as the word Krishna, Muhammad, Allah, or any other divine being. And that is because the United Nations is based on a humanistic understanding of these principles rather than a sacred one or a faith-filled one in the same way that we would understand it. We also see the references that are very similar to our own sense of global mission: social progress, improving the lives of people, references to freedom, as well as practicing tolerance and living together in peace and economic and social advancement that will ring true for us as well in terms of understanding responding to human need by loving service. Note who the members of the United Nations are, and there's a lot of confusion about this in the press, so I did want to focus on this. Notice that the United Nations is not one body. It is not the Wizard of Oz behind a panel deciding what happens with the world. It is made up of the member states of the United Nations, the governments who make decisions between themselves. And yes, we do have a Secretary General who's very visible, but he does not make the decisions the member states do. And altogether, they create the international organization we know as the United Nations. Same thing for this, we're going to continue through Article 1. And the main thing I want to point out to you once again is equal rights, self-determination of peoples, respect for human rights, and for fundamental freedoms, regardless of race, sex, language, or religion. With a reminder, we are in 1945. There has been a lot of progress on civil rights since then, and lack of progress that would not be reflected in this document that reflects the times. So what about, we've had a look at the so-called secular global mission of the United Nations, which is universal, international in its scope. It is truly designed to be a charter for the entire world and its peoples. There's a second way in which the United Nations is fairly unique in terms of its global mission, and that is that its breadth and scope. Today, it is most countries of the world, currently 193 rather than 50 member states. And the original mandate has expanded to the 5 pillars of action that are mentioned there, as well as additional critical global issues of concern. I simply need to mention climate change or the pandemic, and you'll say, oh, of course, we understand. It's a mandate that is expanding as the global needs need to be addressed. Now, fortunately, we're not going to spend much time on this. I just want to point out through this organogram of how exactly large the United Nations is. This represents the United Nations system consisting of 6 main organs, as well as a whole panoply of UN agencies. Together, they make up the so-called UN system. I'm sure you're familiar with things such as the World Health Organization or UNICEF. And if you think that the Episcopal Church has a lot of alphabet soup, welcome to the United Nations. We could swim for days in acronyms. So having thought a little bit about comparing the global missions of the Church and the United Nations, let's now move on to comparing what does it look like for women in mission in the United Nations context, as well as in the context of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion. So we're first going to talk about the United Nations. First thing we can say is that, and it will be no surprise to you, that women have been present from the beginnings of the United Nations as participants and leaders. We make up half the sky, half the world's population. So it's no surprise that women have been present there since the beginning as participants, as staff members, as governmental diplomats, representing representatives of NGOs, but also family members who may have been in the background, but equally supportive to enable the work that has been done by their partners in their work at the United Nations. And significantly for us, there have been also a good number of early women leaders at the United Nations. I could point out so many of them, but I just want to name a few now. The first from 1945 is someone, unfortunately, I do not have a photo of here, but she was Australia's only female delegate to the founding conference. And she famously said, and this is worth repeating, where the rules are silent, women are not usually considered. That was Jessie Street, the Australian delegate to the Conference of San Francisco, the only female delegate at the Conference of San Francisco. But there were 4 women who signed the UN Charter in San Francisco. On our screen here, we have Frida Dahlen from Norway, who was part of the first Norwegian delegation to the United Nations and the first woman to speak at the General Assembly. Hooray for Norway. They're often the first, along with the other Nordics, to advance women's concerns. And of course, on the right, we have our favorite Episcopalian at the United Nations, Eleanor Roosevelt, who we know was a woman of great faith, very deeply connected to her Episcopal faith. Apparently the same could not be said of her husband, but in any case, she was deeply Episcopalian, but represented the United States at the United Nations, and was also named as the chair of the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the first chair of the Human Rights Commission. So yay for Eleanor and yay for us. And here we have a wonderful picture of her holding the final version of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are many others that I can name, but I will stop there because it's more important as well to talk about how women have also been present, women and girls have been present in the sense that their status and place in society have been subjects of study, discussion, and action. And one of the most important bodies, and many of us will recognize this, is the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which was established in 1946. And another quote worth mentioning here from the first chairwoman, Bodil Begtrup, in 1946, who said, "I'll ask of you, of all the rights you have, which do you think are too many for women? What is too much?" Thank you, Bodil. Bears repeating today. The UN Commission on the Status of Women has met pretty much every year ever since. It's described, as you see above, as the principal UN agency to promote empowerment and advancement of women and gender equality. They are 2 halves or 2 hinges of the same idea, and its role is to study and talk about what's happening with women around the world, promote their rights, and shape gender equality and gender justice policies. And their role has increased since 1996 with the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which I'll discuss in a moment, and the importance of gender mainstreaming that's currently underway across the UN system. On the left is a book that you can read on the UN Women's webpage, very instructive. And for those of you who have been at the United Nations at UNCSW or who would like to come in future, this is a place where we will discuss and do advocate for the issues that were raised yesterday, in particular by Carolyn. It was all I could do not to raise my hand and say, let's get in touch so we can help you advocate about the gender-based violence that you are encountering and about the land rights issues that you have experienced as a widow. Those are things we speak about at the United Nations, both the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion, and that's why we're here. And that's why we bring you there, in order to share your voices and advocate for you and with you. One of the principal UN agencies, that not the only exclusive one, but the principal one that we'll talk about today, is UN Women, which had predecessors that we don't have time to discuss. The main thing to know is that in 2010, various divisions for the advancement of women and another predecessor, UNIFEM, were consolidated. Note how recently that is. It's only about 10 years old. That doesn't really say that much, does it, about the seriousness of women's empowerment at the United Nations. But UN Women does a great job. They're involved in all the areas of the work that we're going to describe now. And they are the first port of call for anybody who is studying or working in the area of women's rights. They are the secretariat that runs the UNCSW every year. And so we have a lot of work with them. It's also worth mentioning that there are member states who gather together in smaller groups in order to advance different causes. And we do have a group that works on gender parity, as well as other issues such as girls. So Germany and the Nordics have been very, very important allies in this. Believe it or not, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates are also part of the gender, excuse me, something happened to my screen. There we go. Also part of the gender parity group. And we have member states such as Canada, who are known to place particular emphasis on lifting up girls in particular. So a third way in which women are a focus for mission at the United Nations is through the international legal mechanisms that have been created to support and protect them ever since the founding of the United Nations. We've already talked about the UN Charter. The next big one is obviously the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the first legal document to protect human rights and codify that into international law, along with two other international covenants that came later, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. A little fun fact that I learned and in preparing for this is that in the photo on the right, we have Hansa Mehta of India, who was a delegate to that conference. And she is widely credited with changing Article 1, which in a draft form was meant to read, "All men are born free and equal." And Mehta apparently talked to Eleanor and said, "We need to get this changed to all human beings are born free and equal." So thank you, Mehta. Thank you, Eleanor. If we had not had those women's leaders at the United Nations, and remember, we lift them up because of their importance, but they are a drop in an ocean. And as much as we love and appreciate our men, to have the voices of women speaking up for these kinds of changes creates critical opportunities that might otherwise be lost to women around the world. So thank you to both of them. And we need more women at the United Nations to do that. The UN, I've already referenced the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And as part of that, the UN has organized a series of world conferences for women. The most recent was back in 1995, and they're called the World Conferences on Women, and that one was the fourth. It's also known very fondly to those of us who do this work as Beijing, simply, which means Beijing 1995, which was when that critical conference for women was held. In particular, we may remember this lady who was at the conference and that very famous phrase that she helped to utter, along with others: "Women's rights are human rights." This is considered a landmark for women's rights and women's empowerment around the world. We do have an American represented here, but the impact of Beijing was truly and is truly worldwide. Why? Because in part, Beijing came up with the seminal platform document to guide women's rights and advancement and gender equality around the world that's still being used today, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And it's most notable because it came up with 12 critical areas of concern. So basically a framework for how the United Nations was going to approach its dialogue and discussions and deliberations about the status of women around the world. We don't have time to go into all of them, but I just want to point out that this past year's UNCSW in March focused on gender and climate and gender and disaster risk reduction. So obviously falling under the women and the environment pillar. And so it goes. We've just passed our 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and it continues to remain one of the critical documents for how the United Nations has thought about the advancement of women's rights and women's empowerment around the world. There are many, many other critical international conventions and treaties that I could name, and your heads would be whizzing if I put a slide up for each one. So I will just mention in 1979, the passage of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, also known as CEDAW, which has been ratified, I think at this point, by every single member state except one. And guess who that is? That is the United States. Unfortunately, that is frequently one of the trends of the United States is to not sign international conventions. There are others, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention, the International Conference on Population and Development, which affirms women's rights to sexual and reproductive health, very important for us in the Episcopal Church. There is a Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security, as well as the International Convention for Peoples with Disabilities, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I could go on and on. Women are implicated in every single one of these treaties in some form, but these are some of the highlights where member states have actually committed themselves to certain actions to protect women and advance their rights. The SDGs deserve special mention. Hopefully this is very familiar to you, as you are probably doing something of this sort in your global mission work. The SDGs were preceded in 2000 by the Millennium Development Goals. There were 8 of them, and the objective was to achieve the end of poverty by 2015. Well, that didn't happen, did it? And so they extended the MDGs to make them into the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17. And one of the important highlights and revisions that happened was the creation of Goal 5 on gender equality as a specific goal for the eradication of poverty, this time by 2030. These are very important, especially because we have passed this as policy on behalf of the General Convention. I will show a slide later that shows to what extent General Convention is involved in supporting and enabling our ministries at the United Nations. It's also important because Episcopal Relief and Development has chosen it as a marker for its work in sustainable development and humanitarian assistance. There are many, many things that I could say about the current issues that the United Nations is focusing on, besides the long haul work as it is described by Reverend Margaret Rose, who's the former director of women's ministries and currently the ecumenical and interreligious deputy for the presiding bishop. But let me just point out 1 or 2. Obviously, the first is the pandemic's effect on women. I think I probably don't need to go into detail here. We all have heard by now the term shadow pandemic to refer to the rise in domestic violence, in particular during the lockdowns, the inordinate effect on women of having to stay home, women who are involved in healthcare and the care economy who were overworked and at great risk during the pandemic, and women who had to leave the job force in order to take care of their children and other dependents during lockdown. As a result, as you probably know, there has been a major backslide in terms of the advancements of women since the pandemic. And this has been a particular focus for UN Women and for the UN system at large, with the creation of a humanitarian response plan. And I'll just mention one way in which UN Women has responded. They have created a COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker to follow 3,000 policy measures across 219 countries and territories. Gender-based violence is another ongoing issue of concern, so much so that it has been proposed as a standing item every year at the Commission on the Status of Women. And one of the statistics that's regularly lifted up is that 1 in 3 women will experience that in their lifetimes. It is considered another pandemic, and one that is persistent in spite of the progress for women in terms of gender equality. So the progress is slow, but the issue of gender-based violence is still extreme. And finally, I wanted to focus a little bit on Generation Equality Forum, which is a new initiative of UN Women that was born of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. As you can imagine, they did a giant rethink of what does it look like 25 years after Beijing. And what they found was we've made progress in terms of women's rights. Women are better educated. There are more women in the workforce, more women participating politically, but there is still the glass ceiling. There is still the stained glass ceiling, as we know. And there are many ways in which gender equality will not be achieved, they estimate, for the next 200 years. So UN Women decided to put together a coalition in order to try to accelerate the progress of gender equality by putting together these 6 action coalitions that you see here. And they have come up with an assessment of, as far as 2021 is concerned. So this is really one of the latest messages to come out of UN Women. And it sums up better than I can their views on where women are at today in terms of their own rights and gender equality. So I'm going to play this short clip for you.
Women leaders have been widely praised for their response to the coronavirus, slashing infection rates while keeping the public on side.
A woman who is able to negotiate, to compromise, to find alternatives is an example of strength.
Porque las mujeres salimos a defender. Porque las mujeres queremos que nuestros hijos que vivan bien y las mujeres luchamos.
All of us are put in boxes by our family, by our society, our moment in history, even our own bodies. Some people have the courage to break free.
The purpose of this sort of abuse really is to try and silence us. And, I don't want them to succeed, which is why I carry on speaking out.
A system of justice will be the richer for diversity of background and experience. It will be the poorer if all of its members are cast from the same mold.
Women are now calling for a leapfrog to 50% representation or parity in all spheres, including cabinets, corporate boards, throughout the economy.
Dream with ambition, lead with conviction, and see yourselves in a way that others may not, simply because they've never seen it before.
So there we have a summary of current thinking from UN Women, which really leads the United Nations system in the messaging about women's rights, where we stand with that, the importance of it. We've seen it traced throughout the Charter and the subsequent international agreements. And we have touched a little bit on the main issues at play. Now we're going to turn our attention to the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion. in the last 15 minutes and look at what does it mean for our women to go to the United Nations with a sense of global mission that is based in our faith and to operate in this system, which is secular in its focus. And yet we have seen a little bit of the commonalities in terms of human rights, in terms of gender equality, and that these are reflected in the words of Jesus and the way in which he placed women at the heart of his ministry and cared for them. So before we do, I just want to point out one little thing, which is, for the most part, the people at the United Nations are diplomats, they're government representatives, or they are UN staff. But the United Nations also has a way of working with the rest of us. That is to say, the global term civil society, which is used to describe people who walk in from the street, who are not members of the United Nations, and also non-governmental organizations, of which the Episcopal Church is one, the Anglican Communion is another, and we are representing our faith when we go to the United Nations. So what does it look like to work in this tension, this interplay of lenses of global mission at the United Nations for our Episcopal and Anglican women? And what exactly do they do? And what do they say? We're going to explore that in the next couple minutes. Whoops. One of the most important things to say, and I think this is a wonderful, wonderful point to lift up, is that we know that Episcopalians have been involved with the United Nations since before its founding. We have done research to document that, which you can find on our webpage. But one of the ways in which we have been most involved at the United Nations to the present is through the grassroots work of women, as well as some of the women leaders around the Episcopal Church. So that's women that we know who have been given positions as religious leaders. And it's also hundreds and probably thousands of Anglican and Episcopal women whom we do not know. And yet we know that they have participated in some way in our church's ministries with the United Nations. So that Episcopal grassroots female women movement is what has propelled our church to a closer relationship with the Anglican Communion and its own presence at the United Nations over the last few decades. And we start with Ann Smith, who is the former director of Women in Mission and Ministry for 17 years in the Episcopal Church, who attended in 1975 the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. And before that, as a young woman, she told me she attended the 1975 Conference on Women in Mexico City. Now, I stress that Anne is not represented in this photo. This is a photo of the NGO forum which she attended, but I wanted to share it with you to give you a sense of the feel of the grassroots nature that Beijing represented, both as an intergovernmental meeting with the gathering of member states that we saw in a previous photo, and also an enormous grassroots effort. A lot of times we talk about this as being in parallel that we saw at Beijing. One of the things Anne has shared is that one of the ways in which our Anglicans and Episcopalians were involved was in the writing of a special prayer called the Beijing Noonday Prayer, which was prayed every day at 12 o'clock in the area where you were. And in particular, the Daughters of the King, our very own Daughters of the King, committed themselves to praying this prayer throughout the Beijing conference. And according to Anne, that had an enormous impact. One of the major issues at stake, which was successful at Beijing, was the protection of reproductive rights. That is a subject that comes up and is controversial year after year, and that is continues to be the case today. So this is the prayer that we continue to pray with our delegations every year at UNCSW. And again, I'll skip to the next slide so that we can move ahead, but it will be in the PowerPoint. The Office of Women in Mission and Ministry and the subsequent Office of Women's Ministries, run by the Reverend Margaret Rose and her deputy Kim Roby, from 2000 to 2009, published several publications for and about women that helped to build on the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Here are some of them. They may be familiar titles to you. and in particular, lifting women's voices, lifts up prayer specifically around the Millennium Development Goals, which were in operation at the time. The Office of Women's Ministries also published and started a platform called Beijing Circles, which was a sort of study group whereby women in the Episcopal Church would study the Beijing Declaration for Platform for Action and how that applies to their lives. So this is a direct application of the UN Convention, the UN Treaty, and how that applies to us as Episcopal women. And it is a theme for us that one of the ways in which we engage is through learning from the United Nations and also bringing our own experiences to the doors of the United Nations and the tables. Since 2015, we have had accredited delegations of our own as the Episcopal Church. And I have a contrast here between two pictures. One is pre-2020 and one is the current day. We have had to move with the pandemic to virtual delegations, obviously, in the same way that we have done here in GEM. But these have been wonderful opportunities to continue the work of bringing delegations that was started by Anne Smith, Margaret Rose, in conjunction with the Anglican Communion, when these two bodies came together and continue to come together every year, not just to attend the United Nations, but also just to have a global gathering for Anglican women around the world. These are just a few of the organizations from our own church that have been involved with the Episcopal, with UNCSW in Beijing since then. In particular, Anglican women's empowerment is important because it was founded in order to continue the work of CSWs throughout the year. And here are just a few ways in which General Convention and Executive Council have responded to lifting up women's needs and our resolutions that we bring with us as delegations. In 2020, we hosted an online study group looking at Beijing and its applications to the church. And one of the things we found was that up until the closure of the women's desk in 2009, there were the concerted efforts that you have just shown. However, that closure has hurt our women in the Episcopal Church ever since. That said, we persist. And through various women's organizations and through the work of women around the Episcopal Church, the work itself continues, but in a decentralized manner. We continue as well to work with the Anglican Communion at the United Nations through the Gender Justice Office, the Anglican Communion's delegations, and the work of the International Anglican Women's Network. And here we are as a combined delegation at one of the CSWs. And we work ecumenically with an organization called Ecumenical Women, especially in terms of our advocacy. So I like to think of our advocacy and our work at the UN for women as being threefold, because it's quite complicated and we have to find some ways to break it down. And so the first way that we talk about it is as a ministry of presence, the simply showing up at the United Nations, whether that be in person or whether that be virtually. We are the incarnation of Christ wherever we go as Christians, and we bring that with us. We bring our faith with us, and showing up in UN corridors is extremely important in order to have that influence. We also have a ministry of advocacy, which is much more technical, but this is where we get to defend General Convention resolutions and speak to the issues that are being discussed at the United Nations. And here we have one of our delegates from Italy who had met with the Italian mission to talk about various things that the Episcopal Church was lifting up, in particular our stance on reproductive rights and our approach to that, which they found to be extremely fulfilling. This slide is just to point out one of the ways in which we are able to insert our faith values into a text. This is a statement that we produced for migrants and refugees, in which we talk about Jesus and Jesus's love for migrants and refugees and his place in that identity. I mentioned that General Convention, Executive Counselor are very important to our ministry. In fact, we can't do anything without them because we represent the church when we go. And these are just a sampling of some of the resolutions that have been passed that empower our work. And finally, Ministry of Hospitality, a bit on hold at the moment. Our hospitality is through Zoom, but in happier days, and hopefully we will return to hospitality at the Episcopal Church Center. And there I have a picture from my own parish, the French Church of Saint-Esprit, where we welcome some Anglican delegates to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. We also work on church-wide priorities as women at the United Nations. The picture of me with my baseball cap is a bit of a joke. I don't walk around the United Nations with that on my head. It's rather an example of how I would not choose to do evangelism at the UN. We do it more by stealth. We do have many, many conversations about faith, but I couldn't resist that moment and also including it here. We work on racial reconciliation. Here we have a group of women delegates who came for the UN General Assembly special session on racial reconciliation and drugs, and a visit to the memorial for the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Creation care, I'm sure, is a priority for all of us, and that includes our work at the United Nations. And I also wanted to just mention, and I know she has a workshop coming up right after this, the work of Dr. Chiseche Mbenge as the Director of Gender Initiatives as another way in which we have women present at the UN lifting up the Sustainable Development Goals, and also significant work on what's known as the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, and also the work of Yvonne O'Neill, who is present here today, especially with the NGO Committee to Stop Trafficking in Person, another wonderful Episcopal woman who is present in her own right as a representative of another non-governmental organization, an Episcopalian. We have done work with Indigenous peoples, specifically the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples as recently as last week. And we also work with the girl child through the Working Group on Girls and the International Day of the Girl Child. The little girl in the corner in the picture is now 15 years old. She's a member of my parish. She's hardly recognizable, and they still focus on that time we took them to the UN. So what are the fruits of all of these ministries? There are many different ways in which we can highlight them. I will skip to the next slide because I know we're running out of time, but I did want to just mention a few things that we have learned. And I thought it would be more interesting, since I have been speaking for 45 minutes, to talk to you, to lift up some of the voices of some of the women who have attended. I'm not going to read the quotations. I'll just give a moment or two of silence so you can read them, and they will be in the PowerPoint. But I asked a series of questions to a few, and I thank all of them. And we'll find ways to publish all of this in full and share it with you. But one of the questions I asked was, how does the secular lens of the UN affect your sense of this ministry and your sense of global mission from a Christian point of view? And there we have a couple quotes. This is from the Office of Women's Ministries former director, Reverend Margaret Rose. This one is from Curamoto Jimenez de Salazar from the Diocese of Venezuela, who has attended UNCSW with us many, many years and is a wonderful advocate for this work. This is from Dr. Chiseche Mbenge, who is giving a workshop this afternoon and is herself an international human rights lawyer and a wonderful partner of all of our work at the United Nations. And here we have the words of one of our missionaries who has served as a delegate to the COP26 meeting this past November. So I wanted to just say a few concluding thoughts in about another minute based on what we have seen in this comparison. Going back to our original questions about comparing the two global missions and the lens that we see. Do we see Christ reflected at the United Nations? And how do we reflect Christ at the United Nations when we are in a situation where we can't really proclaim Christ in the same way that we would inside a church sanctuary, for example? And yet we do have ways to express our faith through our actions, through our presence, through our statements, through our prayers individually with diplomats who will whisper to us that they too are Christians, or that in the case of one diplomat, that he wanted to be a priest, in fact, and could we pray with him? We didn't even have time to tell him why we were there. He was so interested in talking about his faith. So that is also very much part of the UN context. We see that both organizations lift up the value of human life, but that the United Nations does not reflect our Creator or Jesus's saving grace. And that is our job to do when we show up, to be able to share that in the ways that we can. We see that the work on women is robust in both areas, but in all of our organizations and in our overall context, that nowhere have women achieved the gender equality in society or in our organizations that we all long for. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? In the case of the United Nations, it's better equipped than the Episcopal Church, because guess what? We don't have an Episcopal Church women agency anymore since 2009. It depends upon the grassroots work of women to lift up women's rights repeatedly. And fortunately for those of us who are men or of other genders who identify as women, it's something where all of us have a place at the table and an important mission in this regard. So in a mirror, dimly, yes, we do see Christ reflected in the face of the other at the UN, although the terms are couched differently. But the UN is a global mission field in which Christian women and all women can and do thrive as actors and agents of global mission, and bring to the table the issues that need to be addressed to ensure their advancement and empowerment. It's a mission field, like I just said, that requires us all, because it is a mission field that's far from equal. Carolyn, unfortunately, had to share with us something that is very true in Kenya and is true to other extents around the world, that we can only speak with our voices to lift up the invisible concerns that continue to create inequality in our world today. So there's much that remains to be done, both in our church, in the Anglican Communion, and at the United Nations. It's not just a mission for women, it is a mission for all of us. Women are half the sky, but it requires all of us at 100% capacity to achieve what we need to do for women. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing your fascinating work. Here we are. I'm just thinking about the great power that you all exude, and moving in the secular world to really build up these principles and values that are sacred and divine. We intend to break out into small groups, but just to keep us on track with time, I wonder if there's a question or a remark that someone would be willing to share in response to Ms. Main's presentation. We do have a few moments for that. So thank you again. That was really fantastic. Thoughts? Maybe you can, if you have a thought, you could just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Well, Lynn, thank you so much. What a wonderful and powerful presentation. We have such a big mission ahead, I believe. I just said, as you are going through the UN and in communion and Episcopal Church involvement, I had one small question. I know at one instant you mentioned about girl child, but there had been, from our missional point of view, there had been killing of girl children in many countries, including India, I would say. And to some extent, some time ago, I kind of understood Trinity Church in Wall Street had something to do with the one diocese back home to stop these girl children. Now that people are civilized or, coming to be educated and all, it's not so vivid and clear to these eyes of people, but it's still happening underneath. And in many other countries as well, I would think, like in African countries. So Anglican Communion Mission and Episcopal Mission, and in your studies of such a vast field from UN point of view, is there any words of wisdom or advice that you will bring for us?
Thank you very much for that question. The issue would couch itself, the phenomenon would couch itself under the term gender-based violence from a United Nations perspective. One of the things that we find, those of us who work in mission at the United Nations do, is we interpret language between our Christian understanding or popular understanding and the United Nations language. I would say the most important thing that we can do on that as Christians experiencing that is to communicate what's happening, much like Carolyn did yesterday, to make sure that that is known, preferably in printed word or on the internet, so that it can be shared widely, social media as well. And then we have the opportunities to connect through the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion to the UN offices through the Anglican Communion's office for the UN and our Episcopal Church office for the UN. And we can work with you from there on other strategies to help bring attention to that issue and also to advocate for change. It is something that is well known already. A lot of times the rub comes at the national level because, once again, the UN is made up of member states. So all of these wonderful, beautiful agreements that we have been looking at are only as good as the countries of the world agreeing to adhere to them. So gender-based violence is an area where this continues to be a problem, and obviously climate change, as we know. So please get in touch with us. I think I've left my email, but I can send it to you as well so we can work together on it.